All right, let's get started. So here's what we've got going on. We've got a couple of parts here. Of course, this is the Macropad video. I'm making a Macropad. This is really just so you can follow along. You can build the whole thing as long as you already have all the components I have here. I'll explain how to get some of these, explain how to solder everything together. Most importantly, just really show you how to build it once you have everything here. So we're going to go through everything that I have on the table. I'll explain like the tools you're going to need as we get to that step. I have my soldering iron ready over here, and I'll kind of explain some soldering technique, not terrible much, but just demonstrate how to build this entire thing from the bottom up. So without further ado, let's just go over the parts. So we've got the case, of course, 3D printed. I'm not going to explain how to print this. The most important part that you need to know is really just use whatever filament you're comfortable with. And the tolerances are very, very important and will be very annoying to have to deal with. So just be aware of that. This cable inside, I will explain how to make in a second, but it is pretty much, it's on the GitHub. What you need to understand is just that this is a USB-C female breakout with some cables stuck to it and a JST jack. Just make sure to match the pinout on the back of the PCB when I show that off. Here is the PCB. As you can see, the PCB here, it's got all the labels for all of the holes. We've got the Pi Pico pinout on here, and we've got the backing here where there's a lot of information that you need to have, basically how to make that jack I mentioned just a second ago, and just like all of the connections to where the switches will go. Of course, you're going to need a Pi Pico. This one I made myself, but basically what you gotta do is just get a stock Pi Pico or one with the consistent same pinout. I like mine the best because it's of course USB-C, even though we're not really using that in this project. And it's also got the reset button natively on the board, which I think is really helpful for all kinds of situations where you're trying to debug. We also have, of course, 12 switches and 12 keycaps. These ones are blank white XDA keycaps. I find these to be they're the best for like Macropads and stuff like this, just because they don't have any labels on them, and I think that's really like important when you're trying to not make something specific for an application, especially since you're not going to find F13 caps anywhere really, unless you're like looking at some really niche stuff. Other than that, I'm going to demonstrate how to put these on the board, how to like solder them down, but also like how to just kind of work with switches if you don't already know how to work with switches. In fact, I will just do that in a moment after I finish going over all the parts. Tolerances are a big issue with all of this stuff. I want to go back over the PCB real quick. The first generation of this PCB has a little bit of some tolerance issues when playing with the case, so you might have to sand it down using a file or using some sandpaper. Just be aware of that, but if you're getting this as a kit, I'm already going to take care of that for you. This PCB also does have the JST connector right here, and this needs a JST connection, female connection right here. I will demonstrate how to do that as well, but it's going to be a little bit tight. You just got to make sure that you cut the pins off. You got to make sure to terminate the pins so that they're flat on the opposite side and that they don't really interfere with the Pico once you solder it down. You're also going to need some diodes. These are just some 1N, I think these are 4148s, just fast switching diodes mostly. You can find them for any keyboards. Some pads if you want these, if you really want these, but meh. I'm probably not going to use them. I might use them on this one just for the heck of it. And then so you need some cables, some little tiny wires, which I will show what are needed for in a minute. Also, we also need the switch plate. As you notice when I talk about 3D printing and tolerances, the switch plate does have the same kind of little tolerance issues. This one splits on the corners on the holes. You can either just, like when you slice it, just make it slightly bigger. You can either do that, or I'll release a update to all of mine as just to fix some of the tolerance issues on the PCB. So with that out of the way, let's go over how to actually build your switches. So I have a whole bag of switches here, but through the power of buying 2 of them, I already have my entire switchboard prefabbed and ready to go. So what we're gonna do with this is we are going to put all the switches and keycaps on. We're gonna do this now just to make it a little bit easier and also to like start us off on something that's not super complicated. We will do the once we start soldering, we'll start doing everything with soldering. Of course, XDA keycaps I mentioned because they're universal and you can put them in any direction. So you're just going to take your switch, here, and you're just going to kind of thread that on there and then just push it really tight, of course. There we go. And then once we get the switch plate, if you've never done this part before, just make sure that you line it up in the correct orientation and then just push it in so it locks. And then just like that, you've got a whole board of switches. Now that we're here, we got to kind of start soldering because there's a lot of things to do here and there's a lot of parts and pretty much everything here needs to be soldered in minus the stuff that's already on the switch plate and already glued in. So to make this cable, you're just going to line up the PCB pins that I showed earlier. And you're going to connect those in the same way with this cable here. You're then going to just solder it directly there. If you don't want to use the JST connector, well then you don't have to. You can just solder it straight to the board. You're just kind of going to lose a little bit of the ability to pull this whole thing out at any given moment, which if that's not really important to you, then it's not really a big deal. So what we're going to start with is I have my soldering iron set to about 360 C. I leave it a little hotter than most people do, which is not a big deal. I think it's good in this situation specifically. Some things that I think might be beneficial for certain people is if you have one, a PCB mount would be good. I don't really think it's necessary for most applications. In this one, you can mount the PCB in a rack and then you can flip it over and manage everything. But I'm going to demonstrate how to do everything without any specific tools and just basically soldering iron and monkey brain. First things first, you're going to make sure that your connector here lines up with the piece that we made a second ago. And I know this is kind of far away, but you don't really need to see any of this. And then once we do that, we're just going to flip our PCB over and we're just going to line it up and guarantee that it is in the right orientation for soldering it down. As I said a second ago, if you're doing this, if from a kit, this is probably already done for you because I think the hardest part of this is cutting the pins on the connector itself down. If you're going to do that, I think the best way to do that is with a pair of snips, preferably flush cutters. I just don't own any. I probably should buy some. Cut them away from you into a trash can, not near any screens that you can possibly damage or chip, as from experience. And basically just get it as low as possible, check that everything is completely flush, and we're gonna try and solder completely flush as well. Now the reason we're doing that is because this Pi Pico is going to then also be soldered flat onto this board here. And because of that, we want to just make sure that everything is perfect. I do everything a little bit more scuffed than most people, and I acknowledge that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this cap, which just so happens to be around the same thickness as this little tiny JST connector. That is not going to focus, but what basically we are going to do is we're going to line this up on the back, push it flat onto the surface, and we're going to use the soldering cap as a support. So now our pins are in there, and if, like I said, most people probably won't need to do this if you're just going to solder it straight down, which is honestly most likely preferential. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some liquid flux. I recommend liquid flux. A lot of people like flux pens. I think that flux pens are great for certain applications, but and liquid flux does suck in most applications, but I like liquid flux. It gets in the crevices and it helps stuff stick. I've never had good experiences with flux pens, so we're just not going to do that. I'm using leadless solder, or lead-free solder, even though it still has lead in it. Make sure to clean the tip of your soldering iron. You can't really see my soldering iron over here because I don't really need to have it on camera. But as you can see, I have a really fine tip. I think a fine tip would be good for this application. However, you could use most other things. All right, so now that we're zoomed way in so you can see it a little bit better, I have my soldering iron here. I'm just going to I'm going to put some solder onto the tip here. I was going to put it directly on there, but I don't think that's necessary. we're just going to very slight. As you can see, I am not the most stable person. Just going to make sure this is perfectly balanced. I said I was scuffed, I was not kidding. And we're just going to very lightly tap it. Yes, get in there. So, one thing I said earlier, I really want to make sure that these are flush as possible. I am going to be doing my best to do that. That's partially why I'm using liquid flux as well. I'm trying to get this as low as possible, and I'm going to solder wick these in a minute. Luckily, that will not be necessary for somebody doing the rest of this. Nice, nice, nice. Now, those are garbage, but they will do for what our application is. An option for getting rid of some of the solder, now that this is flat, I can just I can clean off my soldering tip first, then I can just go over these, heat them up again, and really make sure that they're going to get flat. In fact, what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to solder sucker a little bit of the top layer of this off. I've done this before just to make stuff a little bit cleaner, but I think it's always worth a shot just to see if I can get it to be perfect. Also just because I'm really picky about this kind of stuff. Perfect. That's good enough. Good enough for me. So as you can see, this is on the back here. We can make sure that this lines up with what we were expecting. I did mismatch the colors on my case, but as you can see, the whole point of this was to check that, to make sure this goes in, and then to validate that this connector will actually, work with this here. One method I like to do is I like to go here. I like to grab my multimeter, turn it on to the continuity check, and I like to validate with a level of certainty that yes, it does actually work, and once I actually put this together, this will be fine. Now, I only typically do this with connectors because I don't trust connectors, and also with these kinds of funny joints. But what I do is I go into, oh, this is not going to go in frame. I go into the actual jack and I just touch one of the connection pins and make sure that it connects. Nice. And now that I see that, I'm good. Here's a second board that I have. Do the exact same situation. Make sure this lines up correctly. Push it into this slot. These ones actually, this board specifically has a little bit shorter pins on it. There we go. I like to start from the top pin. Not that it matters actually at all. Okay. Now let's get our solder sucker back out. Nice. As you can see, those are very, very tiny pins. I do not think I can get that in focus. Okay, maybe a little bit. You can see these are very flat now, and when this PCB goes on flat, it won't rock around that much. As you can see, this PCB kind of the Pico goes down very flat, and hopefully it'll not have any trouble. All right, so I went back and cleaned up my solder joints on this PCB, and the next thing I always recommend doing, and this is really for everything, but for this one I think I'm going to do it just for the hell of it. Clean all of your solder joints with isopropyl alcohol if you're using flux. So of course, if you're into 3D printing, you probably have a bottle of this 91% isopropyl alcohol. It's kind of really necessary for any soldering or 3D printing or anything that you don't need to get wet with water. So I just put a little bit of this on a shop towel, fold it up, and then just kind of go for it. So as you can probably not see because this is incredibly small, we got rid of all of the flux residue that was sitting around there. Next thing on the itinerary of things we need to do, I think it's probably best if we solder down the Pico first. While I like to do it the different way just to check that everything works, in this case we should just get started. We're just going to drop it flat. In fact, I'll just make sure that it's quite close to flat, and if it isn't, don't worry. The back of my Picos, I think the back of the stock Pico as well, is completely black with solder with a solder mask, so nothing can really, besides these these test points, but it can't really connect with the pins that we just put down. So what we will do is we will just start it by putting it out here. So what I like to do is I start by doing each corner. I put a little bit of flux on both sides, and I start with just the corners really, but you can just get really in there because why not? Yeah, because we're going to need it anyway. And it doesn't really disappear. It'll go through the holes, but just clean up the surface that you're doing this on. Make sure you're not doing anything flammable, that kind of stuff. I know my hands will be in the way for most of this, and I apologize in advance. So we're going to get some solder on our soldering tip. Just a real glob for this first one. And we're just going to start at the bottom, because why not? So what I'm doing is I'm just trying to make a little connection between the PCB and the PCB and the Pi Pico. Now what I'm doing, and this solder connection sucks, to be completely honest with you, because mine's not completely flat, and I was not expecting that when I soldered it, but it's fine. We can make this work. So there we go. It's really nasty, but you can see it there. It's connecting both things. It'll be way easier once we do the flatter pins. In fact, I will demonstrate that now. So what I'm doing here is I am moving I'm putting either solder on here. Make sure to clean your tip again. I'm putting solder either on here if you really want to need a big blob, or what you can do is you can just kind of push the solder wire into the actual board, and then heat it up as it's going down. Oh, I need to tilt this back, I'm sorry. There we go. So what I'm going to do, and my hand's not in the way, hopefully soldering is not the most efficient and easy thing to film. And it looks like my flux disappeared off of there a little bit. But as you can see, that joint is now, you can't really see it, but whatever. You can see that joint is now existent between these two, and now these two are permanently fused. Don't worry if your solder joints look like crap. That is just kind of the nature of this kind of thing. What I like to do now is just pour some liquid solder. This is a crime to some people, but who cares? Get rid of this guy now. I just needed it for holding that up a little bit. Just get it all in there. And I'm really just, my whole goal is just to make this, is to just make it so these joints will go down easy. And I can just efficiently, you know, if I was doing this by myself, put in some earbuds, smash these out. You know, you don't need to go on the top side of the pin on the Pico. I'm doing that more so because I'm paranoid. While I'm doing this, I recommend not using lead solder. I think it's just kind of, lead-free solder is so widely available, and it's not harder to use at all. It's kind of worth it. Something I should also mention while I'm slaving away at this, always have ventilation on when you work on this. I can't do that right now because I'm trying to get good audio, but just in the future, just make sure everybody is having good audio and is, in the future, that's the solder fumes doing that to me. Make sure that you have a fan on or a window open or anything else to make sure that you're not breathing in solder fumes and killing yourself. So, as you can see, these solder joints are kind of shit. They're garbage, but these will do for what we're doing. All right, so now that I have our PCB done, these are probably some of the worst solder joints I have done ever in my entire life. And that's partially because I'm on camera and partially because I'm an idiot. Make sure you don't destroy any of the actual components on top of the Pico. That is always a fun thing. Alternatively, if you do want to, an option is to use pins. Like on this kind of Pico, you can get header pins, and you can just pop this right inside. In fact, I'll go get the other PCB I have for this. As you can see on this PCB, there are holes. So what you can do is you can actually take the headered Pico and you can just kind of push it into the holes if they line up properly ever. Yeah. And then they just click right in, and then you have your Pico in the PCB just like that, and you can actually just solder onto the back, though you are going to have some clearance issues. It might be easier if you cut them down before you solder, but that is always an option if you want to do that. Now that we have this done, what we need to do is we need to take our diodes outside of the socket, or outside of the ribbon. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to fold the legs of our diodes down into like this shape here. This is very hard to display on a camera. On the board itself, these little tiny diode markers are little arrows, and it's like an arrow pointing into a wall. The black point goes towards the wall, and then you're just going to drop each one of these in there after folding it, as is this top one, and then you're just going to go on the back and you're just going to splay the pins out a little bit so it kind of doesn't fall out on you. And I'm just going to do all of those really quick. Now, one thing I do want to mention while I'm working on that is that for one of these, I accidentally filled the hole. So we're going to have to deal with that as we get there. But the situation for fixing that is actually not that complicated. And what we will end up doing is we will just heat the hole while pushing it through, and then it will make it through all the way just fine. All right, so what we're going to start with, and if you get some flux on your fingers, just make sure to wipe that off because it's getting sticky. So what you're going to do is to fix those hold ones, we're going to bend some new diodes that are supposed to go in there. We're then going to heat up the hole and push this through. So it's easier if you thread the other one through the hole first before you push it in. And then what we're going to do is we're going to heat it from the back side while making sure to push it in. Usually that does it. Alternatively, the better solution is to just make sure that you don't do this. All right, so it's a different time of day. I just cleaned up all the solder joints that are on this board here. I made sure to just kind of go through. I tried to like go over all of these edge points again, really clean them up, check for continuity with my multimeter, and just make sure that everything is connected. Then I started installing the diodes in the time. I had class, so I had to stop recording this video. But basically, for the diodes, you just push them in. And then on the back side, we'll actually do the work in a second. I already did half of them, but I just wanted to demonstrate the cleanup on here, because that's very important. Make sure to clean up your flux, all that, of course. These are probably some of the worst solder joints I've ever done in my entire life, but they connect. So let's go back down here. As you can see on here, we've got all these legs still sticking out. And that's perfectly fine. What I did on this side here is I went down and I just tacked each one of these with some solder. Pour some flux on there and then solder it in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the exact same thing on this other side. And basically, you can't really see what I'm doing here, but basically I'm just touching each one of these with some solder, just grazing it and making sure that the solder gets down the hole. Of course, this is very difficult to do when you're on camera and you only have one hand in order to not block the camera. Again, make sure you solder in a well-ventilated area as always. Don't do what I'm doing. All right, so now that we have all those tacked down, we have to do the part that I hate the most, and this is the part we don't get to be on camera for. So make sure you go away from any screens that you have. Ask me how I know that step. And just get your wire cutters out, and you're gonna bend every single one of the pins up a little bit, and then you're just gonna snip them all in order. I don't do this near any device I have that I actually like to have and keep, and I make sure I cut these well with my hands inside the trash can looking away, because these are no joke, and you do not also want to step on these in the middle of the night, so you just want these to be as isolated as possible. All right, we're back. We're back. These are done. As you can see, we got everything tacked down. These aren't the prettiest, of course, but honestly, who cares? I've never been one to care about those specifically. Make sure to go back, clean up everything with some ISO. Always a good option. And for these, because they're sharp, I just tap it. And dabbing these seems to be pretty good. So we have one last thing we need to, well, two things that we need to solder. First being the USB-C port connection to the Pico, because it's a little bit quirky in how this works. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna learn tinning real quick, just a really basic how to tin. And this is something I should have done at the beginning, but you can do this really at either step. It's just a little bit harder at this step. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get some solder on our soldering iron. We're going to get some flux, and we're going to take these little wires and we're just going to put a little drop of the flux on the very tip of the wire. This is impossible to show on camera, so I'm not really going to bother. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to take some solder and we're just going to touch it to the tip of the wire so it gets that little bit of solder on there. There we go. Okay. Now what we're going to do with this is we're going to make the first wire. We're going to make the green wire specifically. Then what we're going to do is on this board, there is at the top, there's this little cutout. And one of these says TP2, and one of them says TP3. The TP3 one goes to the DP over here, and TP2 goes to the DN over here. Now, what you're going to do is you're just going to take the tinned wire, and you're just going to kind of lay it down onto TP3, for instance, and then you're just going to kind of push down with the soldering iron so that it fuses and you don't have to put any extra solder on it. You can, of course, but a thicker soldering tip might also be beneficial for this step as well. All right, so got those tacked in. This is what they look like once they're tacked in completely. These are just very lightly tacked into onto the Pico through the window. And then those are going to be moved up into this position there, onto those pins. So what we're going to do is we're just going to drop a little bit of flux on there. So we've got our board. We can take some rag, put some more ISO on there, really clean it up, because this is probably the last time you're going to be on this side of the board now that we've gotten most of this done. As you can probably see, if I move this back, we've got our Pico soldered down, we've got all of our diodes soldered down, and then we've got the back, we've got our fancy little JST connector, and we've got our wires soldered down as well. Now, this is the fit check, I suppose. I just kind of lightly push this in just enough that it will stay into the board. Just a very light fit check. We're going to push this down just to make sure that everybody is happy. Yeah, that's good enough. I know that why it's pushing back is this connector and the fact that it's not down. So I'm not going to do that. The next thing we need to do is the final thing we need to do besides screwing the thing in, and that is we need to take our switch plate with with all of our switches already put in. You might not want to have the keycaps on. I don't really care, honestly. I think it helps balance it. What you're going to do is you're going to take this pin array here, and you're going to push it down onto the PCB so it lines up with all of the pins specifically. And then my easiest method, as you can see on here, all of the pins are lined up. My easiest method is just take it, push it down a little bit, and then let it come back up. And by doing that, what you're going to do is all of the pins are now seated as flat as possible. This side's going to be a little bit high, which you're just going to have to hold that down. We're going to tack this side first just to make sure. I like to just be very, very light with the switches in case it gets into the switch casing. And then just use a little bit more solder than you did on the previous stuff, because this thing will not will be a little bit bigger holes. There we go. We're going to make sure that is as tight as possible. between the switch plate and the pin. All right, now that we've done that, let's just move on to the other side. I'm just tacking basically the top pin of both of these down, and I'm using very little flux here compared to what I was doing with just spilling flux everywhere on the other side. And that is on purpose. I really don't want to get much flux down in here. I also tend to stay away from traces if I can help it on the actual thing. So now I'm going to go back, now that after I've done all 4 corners, I'm going to go back and I'm just going to start pushing down on each one of these pins and soldering the actual switch down. Okay, so with that, now we have this little unit. This has the switches, this has the Pico, this has everything soldered to the PCB, and it is now ready to go. So the next step is very, very simple. You will simply plug in the JST connector to the case. All right, we are back. So basically my JST connector broke, so I just ended up repairing it with some solder, which is not ideal. Do not do that. Typically, if it breaks, you're kind of SOL, but mine now connects, and I can now drop my PCB into the socket here. As you can see, it fits perfectly. It's almost like I 3D modeled this. So with that, with putting that in here and getting it all situated, I guess we're almost done. We just need to put in the screws, the final finishing touch. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get a standard Phillips screwdriver, and I've got my M2 screws. And I'm just gonna screw these right on in. Now, remember that thing I said about tolerances being funny? Well, tolerances are very funny, and their tolerances are extremely poor with the 3D prints that I've made. And because of that, I tend to blow up the bottom corners on this switch plate. Now, if you're laser cutting it, or you have a better printer than I do, or you size it correctly, or I might even change it myself to just be better with the tolerances, it won't have a 1mm gap on the bottom, but mine does. So what I do is I just angle the screws down a little bit. I kind of give it a little bit of a weirder angle, and that will help it get started in the bottom thread. That's literally the only difference I do, the only difference I make to get it started there. Don't push too hard, because you might also slam into the Pi Pico and destroy some of the components that are on there. But if you are unsure about something with the Pi Pico or anything like that, I would go ahead and not unscrew this down first. I would go and load the software on there, which is the next step, and then do this step just to verify that everything works and that your soldering is good and you didn't short anything and yada yada yada, etc, etc, etc. And with that, let's zoom out a little bit. We've got our Macropad. So now the next step is to turn on the computer and load the software. So now that we're here, let's plug it in our Macropad and make sure this stuff works. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna plug in our Macropad. Hopefully it doesn't smoke. Now, if this has CircuitPython or something on it already, it's going to do something. If it has nothing on it, it's just gonna sit here. I don't have a power LED on these because I don't really think it's necessary for my application. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna go grab the firmware. We're going to unplug, well, we can leave it plugged in for this case. You can hit the boot select and hit the reset button at the same time, or plug it in while holding boot select. And it should pull up the RPi USB drive. And yeah, so as you can see, everything works. I just checked the the keyboard tester, and everything seems to be connected and working, so we should be good to go.